somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a single decision could set off a chain reaction that reaches every gas station, grocery store, and paycheck on Earth. This video explores a hypothetical scenario, not a prediction, not breaking news, just a what-if look at how fragile our global economy really is. So here's the question we're asking today. How quickly could a single spark in the Gulf collapse markets thousands of miles away? Because this isn't really a story about two countries. It's a story about the energy and money sitting in everyone's pocket, everywhere, all at once. Tensions between the United States and Iran have simmered for decades. But let's imagine, just for a moment, that simmering finally boils over. Not a full-scale invasion, not a long, drawn-out war. Just a tight 72-hour window of military action. Short in time, but massive in consequence. In this video, we're breaking it down hour by hour, region by region, from airstrikes to oil shocks to the neighboring countries caught in the middle. And quick honest question before we dive in. Have you ever actually thought about where the fuel in your car comes from? And how fragile that supply chain really is? By the end of this video, you'll understand why a strip of water you've probably never thought about could matter more to your daily life than most headlines ever will. Let's start at hour zero, the moment the first strike happens, and the world starts reacting in real time. In a scenario like this, the opening moves usually look the same on paper. Precision airstrikes aimed at military or strategic infrastructure. But here's the thing military analysts always point out. A strike is easy to launch. Predicting what happens after it lands is the hard part. Because unlike a conventional war between two armies, Iran's response likely wouldn't come from Iran's own soil at all. This is where the concept of proxy forces comes in. Regional groups aligned with Iran that can act without a direct, traceable order from Tehran. Groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Houthi forces in Yemen have historically operated with a degree of independence, while still aligning with Iran's broader interests. This is what analysts call asymmetric warfare. Instead of one big, direct confrontation, you get multiple smaller flashpoints happening almost simultaneously across the region. And that's strategically clever, in a grim sort of way. It spreads the response out, making it harder to trace, harder to retaliate against, and harder to contain. For the average person watching the news, this is exactly why a conflict like this doesn't feel like it stays contained to one country. It never really does. Shipping companies, insurance firms, and airlines start recalculating risk within hours, not because of confirmed danger everywhere, but because of uncertainty everywhere. And that uncertainty alone is often enough to move markets, even before a single additional shot is fired. Which brings us to the actual economic weapon in this scenario. And it's not a missile system or a naval fleet. It's geography. Because Iran doesn't need to win a battle to shake the global economy. It just needs to make one very narrow stretch of water a lot more dangerous to cross. Let's look at the map for a second. Because this next part genuinely surprises most people the first time they see the numbers. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That's roughly the width of a large city. And through that narrow gap passes roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply, every single day. 20% doesn't sound dramatic until you realize that's tankers carrying oil bound for Asia, Europe, and beyond. All funneled through one narrow choke point. So what happens if that choke point becomes too dangerous for shipping companies to risk sending tankers through, even for just a week? Energy analysts have modeled scenarios like this before, and the estimates are genuinely staggering. Oil prices spiking toward $200 a barrel. To put that in perspective, that's roughly double some of the highest oil prices we've seen in recent history. And it wouldn't stay contained to gas stations. Higher oil prices ripple into shipping costs, plastics, fertilizer, food production, and eventually, the price of nearly everything you buy. This is exactly why analysts sometimes call the Strait of Hormuz the world's most important choke point. It's not dramatic language, it's just accurate. And here's the part that makes this genuinely strategic. Iran doesn't need a powerful navy to threaten this route. It just needs presence and uncertainty. Naval mines, fast patrol boats, or even just the credible threat of disruption can be enough to make shipping insurers panic and reroute completely. And rerouting isn't cheap either. Alternative routes around the region can add thousands of kilometers and weeks to a single shipment's journey. So even a partial, temporary disruption doesn't just raise prices, it can quietly strain global supply chains for months afterward. This is why Iran's greatest leverage in this entire scenario was never really about missile range or military size. It's simply about where it sits on the map. Which raises an uncomfortable point worth sitting with. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in geopolitics isn't a weapon at all. It's location. But this crisis wouldn't just play out on a map or in an oil futures chart. It would land directly on the doorstep of Iran's neighbors, starting with Turkey. Let's talk about what a scenario like this would actually mean for a country sitting right next door. Turkey isn't a distant observer in a scenario like this. It shares a border region with the broader crisis zone and deep economic and diplomatic ties throughout it. So let's break down the real risks a neighboring country like Turkey would face if a 72-hour crisis like this actually unfolded. First, migration. Regional instability historically pushes displaced populations toward the nearest stable borders, and Turkey has experienced this pattern before. A sudden spike in regional instability could mean increased pressure on border regions, humanitarian resources, and local infrastructure almost overnight. Second, security. Turkey's military and intelligence resources would need to closely monitor an already complex multi-actor region for spillover risks. That includes tracking movements of armed groups, potential retaliatory strikes nearby, and protecting its own airspace and territorial waters. And third, energy. Turkey imports a significant portion of its oil and natural gas, which means regional price shocks hit its economy almost immediately. Higher energy costs don't stay abstract for long. They show up in electricity bills, transportation costs, and eventually inflation across the entire economy. Now here's where Turkey's position becomes genuinely fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint. It isn't simply a bystander in this crisis. As a NATO member with deep economic and diplomatic ties across the region, Turkey would face intense pressure to take a clear position. But history shows Turkey has often preferred a different role entirely, not picking a side outright, but positioning itself as a mediator between competing powers. That's an incredibly difficult balancing act. Mediation requires trust from multiple sides at once. And in a fast-moving crisis, trust is often the first casualty. If Turkey leans too far toward one side, it risks damaging relationships it's spent years building. Lean the other way, and the same risk applies in reverse. So realistically, Turkey's most likely move in a scenario like this would be diplomatic engagement, offering to host talks, de-escalate tensions, and protect regional stability. And that's not weakness. Historically, being the country everyone can still talk to during a crisis is its own form of significant, quiet power. But even skilled diplomacy has limits. If the crisis escalates far enough, neutrality itself becomes harder and harder to maintain. And that's really the uncomfortable truth about regional conflicts like this one. Very few countries actually get the option to stay completely uninvolved. Distance on a map doesn't always translate to distance in impact, not when energy, trade, and migration are this deeply interconnected. So by hour 72, this scenario has already stopped being a two-country conflict. It's become a regional and arguably global economic event. Which brings us to the question this entire video has really been building toward. Let's zoom all the way back out and look at the full picture we just walked through. A single 72-hour military scenario, precision strikes met with dispersed, asymmetric responses across the region. A narrow strip of water becoming the most economically dangerous choke point on the planet, threatening prices for nearly everyone, everywhere. And neighboring nations like Turkey forced into an impossible balancing act between security, diplomacy, and economic survival. Here's what's genuinely important to remember though. This entire video was a hypothetical model, built to explore how interconnected our modern world actually is. But the underlying mechanics we covered, choke points, proxy dynamics, energy dependency, regional diplomacy, those are very real and very much still in play today. Which is exactly why understanding scenarios like this matters, even if we sincerely hope they never actually happen. Because conflict in a globally connected economy was never really contained to a battlefield. It reaches supply chains, savings accounts, and dinner tables far beyond it. So here's the big question I want to leave you with today, and I'd genuinely love to hear your honest perspective on it. In a conflict like this, where energy, economics, and entire regions are all pulled in at once, can anyone actually walk away a true winner? Or does a crisis this deeply interconnected mean that, in the end, the whole world quietly loses something together? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious how this community sees it. If this video helped you understand just how connected our global economy really is, hit that subscribe button. This is exactly the kind of story we dig into here. We're not just talking about conflict for the sake of conflict. We're talking about how fragile and how connected all of our daily lives really are. And trust me, this is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle shaping the world's energy future. If you want to understand how energy, economics, and global power really connect, this is the channel to be on. Thanks for watching all the way through. That genuinely means a lot. I'll see you in the next one, where we break down another story shaping our world. This has been GeoMind Studio. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll catch you next time.